Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The rain had just begun to fall when Annie first met Amaka. It wasn't heavy, the kind of drizzle that softened the edges of rooftops and made umbrellas bloom like flowers across the street. They were both seated under the faded canopy outside the community hall in Surrey, waiting for the start of a women's health seminar that had already been delayed for over an hour. Annie had come alone, clutching her small handbag, her face faintly tired from a week's work at the salon. Amaka, on the other hand, was scrolling through her phone, sighing in that theatrical way that made others look up. Their first exchange was about the weather, brief, polite. But when the rain picked up and the plastic chairs had to be rearranged, Amaka moved closer to Nne and muttered something sarcastic about Nigerian time. Nne had laughed not because the joke was particularly funny, but because something about the girl felt warm and irreverent, like a spark in an otherwise dull afternoon. In the weeks that followed, their bond grew with surprising ease. Nne, typically cautious with friendships, found herself swept into Amaka's world of spontaneous outings, late-night voice notes, and endless gist. Amaka had this way of telling stories with her entire body, arms flying, voice shifting into characters, and Nne would listen, amused, her quiet laughter blending into the background. They were different in many ways. Amaka was the bolder one, the kind who wore red lipstick on weekdays and flirted openly with strangers. Nne was more reserved, a woman of quiet routines and cautious smiles, but those differences stitched them closer, not apart. When Amaka lost her job and cried through the night on a call, it was Nne who listened. When Nne had a rough week and barely had money for data, Amaka would send airtime without asking. Over time, their connection became something sacred, unspoken yet real, the kind of friendship that bloomed naturally without the need for declarations. So, when Amaka's father died, it didn't feel strange for her to call Nne the very next morning, her voice flat and unfamiliar. "I want you to come with me," she said after a pause. "To the village. For the burial." The request was heavy, but Nne didn't hesitate. She understood what silence meant in moments like this. Amaka had never been one to ask for help easily, especially not like this. Nne asked for the date and booked time off work the next day. She didn't know exactly where the village was, somewhere in Enugu State, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that Amaka needed her. What she didn't know, however, was that this trip would not just be about saying goodbye to the dead. Something else, something life-altering, waited for her there, tucked beneath the surface of a grief-stricken visit, wrapped in the kind of coincidence that only life could design. The bus station in Enugu buzzed with its usual midday chaos, drivers shouting destinations over one another, the pungent smell of roasted corn mixing with exhaust fumes, and hawkers weaving through the parked vehicles with trays balanced expertly on their heads. Nne stood under the faded shade of a kiosk, clutching her small box and scanning faces. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was Amaka's message again. "My cousin Darlington is coming to pick you. He drives a dark green Corolla. He knows what you look like." Nne had read it twice already, unsure whether to be anxious or simply grateful she didn't have to find her way alone. Just as she was about to reply with a thank you, a man in jeans and a checkered shirt approached her with a careful smile. "Are you Nne?" he asked, voice smooth but low. She nodded. "Amaka's cousin," he added, extending a hand. "Darlington." He didn't say much after that. They walked side by side to the car, the kind of silence that didn't feel heavy, just unfamiliar. The road to his place wound through quiet back streets, away from the hum of the town's center. He had offered, without much explanation, that it would be more comfortable for her to spend the night at his house, since Amaka's family compound was already full with guests and relatives. Nne hadn't argued. Inside the car, they talked sparingly at first, surface-level things about Enugu's weather, the heat, the road conditions. But Darlington wasn't stiff. He had an easy, deliberate calmness about him, like someone who chose his words rather than threw them around. At one point, he reached for the car stereo and played some soft highlife music, something N&E hadn't realized she missed. By the time they reached his compound, the early evening light had turned gold, casting long shadows across the yard. His apartment was modest, neat, with clean tile floors and the faint scent of lemon disinfectant lingering in the air. He offered her food. She declined. But they talked. Somehow, after she changed into more comfortable clothes and tucked her things into the corner of the room he gave her, they kept talking. 1 hour became 2, then 3. Later that night, something subtle shifted. They had drifted from casual banter to shared stories, his memories of growing up in Succa, her small victories running a hair salon in Lagos, the weight of choices they both wished they'd made differently. There was no grand seduction, no deliberate flirtation, just a gentle slide of conversation into vulnerability, and the kind of stillness that made silence feel like an answer rather than a gap. At some point, their shoulders touched. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. When he finally leaned in, it was slow, uncertain, like a question waiting to be answered. And she answered, not with words, but with the tilt of her chin and the press of her lips against his. What followed was quiet, intense, and fleeting, like something they both knew wouldn't be spoken of afterward. When it was over, they didn't say much. She curled beneath the wrapper he offered her, and he disappeared into the next room. Sleep came late. The fan above her buzzed softly, but it was the echo of his closeness, not the heat, that kept her eyes wide open for hours. When Minnie opened her eyes, the light filtering through the window was already bright and insistent, casting soft patterns across the tiled floor. For a moment she lay still, staring at the ceiling fan above her as it spun lazily. The air smelled faintly of fried yam, and somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed as if it were still dawn. Her body ached in places she hadn't expected, not painfully, but with the quiet, undeniable reminder of the night before. She sat up slowly, adjusting the wrapper around her chest, her heart beating a little faster. The room was silent. She could hear muffled footsteps from the kitchen, the sound of a cupboard opening and closing, and the occasional clink of plates. Darlington hadn't come back to check on her. He was giving her space, maybe, or avoiding her. Either way, the intimacy of the night had given way to a silence that now felt uncertain. She wasn't sure what she expected, maybe nothing, maybe something. But what she felt, overwhelmingly, was a strange mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. She found him in the kitchen, standing by the counter, scooping boiled yam into a bowl. He looked up when she entered, and for a split second, their eyes held a memory neither of them voiced. "You slept well?" he asked, his voice casual, neutral. She nodded, mumbling something vague about the heat. He offered her a plate, and they sat at the small dining table, eating in near silence. Every now and then he asked a question about her journey, about Amaka's likely mood that morning, but he didn't mention what had happened. And neither did she. It hung between them, like a curtain they both refused to draw. After breakfast, she freshened up and changed into a modest dress suitable for morning. Darlington stepped outside to warm the car, and she took one last look around the apartment, her mind fluttering with unfinished thoughts. As they drove toward Amaka's family compound, the streets seemed different now, quieter, more distant. She stared out the window, her fingers curled tightly in her lap, unsure of what she was supposed to feel. The compound was alive with the sounds of people, relatives arranging chairs under canopies, voices shouting instructions, women moving in and out of the kitchen with large pots. The scent of firewood and pepper soup clung to the air. Amaka spotted her almost immediately and ran over, pulling her into a long, tight hug that said more than words could. NNE smiled, grateful for the familiarity, the distraction. Darlington nodded briefly and disappeared into the crowd, his role as chauffeur now complete. Throughout the day, NNE remained by Amaka's side, helping with guests, keeping her company, occasionally stealing glances across the compound whenever Darlington passed by. But he didn't look at her. Not once. And she didn't call out. The rituals of mourning swept everyone into motion, and NNE moved with them, burying her thoughts beneath the surface. That night, as she lay in a room full of Amaka's aunts and cousins, listening to the low hum of voices and the occasional sob, she stared at the ceiling and whispered nothing. Not to herself, not to God, just silence. Back in Lagos, the rhythm of NNE's life resumed, at least on the surface. She returned to the salon with its familiar clatter of dryers, the scent of coconut oil and relaxer thick in the air, and the endless stream of clients sharing gossip as their hair got braided or curled. Her hands moved with practiced ease, parting and weaving, but her mind drifted far too often. Days slipped into weeks, each one folding quietly into the next, but inside her body, something was changing. She felt it first in the way her appetite altered. Foods she normally loved now made her stomach twist. Then came the fatigue, heavy and unshakable, and the strange tightness in her lower belly. She dismissed it at first. Lagos had a way of making a person feel off balance anyway. Too much heat, too much noise, not enough rest. But when her period didn't come, she grew still inside, listening to her body with a different kind of fear. The pharmacy was only a short walk from the salon. On a slow Thursday afternoon, she slipped out between clients and returned with a small white paper bag. The test was quick. The 2 lines appeared almost immediately, bold, unmistakable, life-altering. Nanny sat on the toilet lid, the stick still in her hand, and stared at the bathroom tiles as if waiting for them to say something wise. But there were no answers, just a sharp awareness that nothing would ever be the same again. Her mind spun slowly. She thought of her mother, who would disapprove but eventually soften. She thought of Amaka, whose voice she could already imagine echoing with questions. And then, inevitably, she thought of him. Darlington, his face in the kitchen that morning, his laugh during the drive. His silence afterward. A part of her wanted to reach out, to dial his number, and say, "It's yours." But another part, larger, louder, pulled her back. Why complicate his life? He hadn't made promises. They barely knew each other. And more than anything, NNE didn't want to be seen as a burden. So she told no one, at least not at first. She went about her business, pressing her palms into aching scalps, tying gelly for Owambi guests, pretending that everything inside her wasn't shifting. As her belly began to swell, she adjusted her wardrobe, wearing looser gowns, blaming weight gain on food. When Amaka visited unexpectedly one Saturday afternoon, she stood behind the salon chair as NNE braided a client's hair, eyeing her carefully. "You're glowing," she teased, nudging her friend's arm. NNE laughed it off. "It's this heat," she said. But that night, alone in her room, she stood before the mirror and lifted her shirt slowly. Her skin was smooth and tight across her abdomen now, and when she placed a palm over it, something fluttered deep inside, like a whisper waiting to be heard. She breathed deeply and whispered back, "It's just us, okay?" Labor came early one rainy morning in July. The sky outside her window was still dark when the sharp twisting pain pulled NNE out of sleep. For a moment she thought it was a bad dream, but the pain returned, deeper, more urgent. She clutched her belly, breathless, and sat up slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. There was no one to call in the room she rented behind the main house. Her neighbors were kind but distant, the sort who exchanged morning greetings, but stayed out of each other's business. She called a Kiki man whose number she had saved months ago. He picked her up within minutes, startled but calm. The clinic was small but clean, and within hours she gave birth to twin boys. Her eyes were swollen with exhaustion when the nurse placed the first child in her arms, then the second, two tiny bodies wrapped in matching cloth, their faces scrunched in protest, yet unmistakably alive. Nan stared at them, dazed and in awe. She hadn't planned for twins. She hadn't planned for anything. Yet here they were, perfect, breathing, and hers. The nurse said something cheerful, maybe a congratulation, but N.N.E. barely heard it. Her eyes remained fixed on the boys, on the curve of their brows, the fullness of their lips, the small cleft in their chins. There was something hauntingly familiar in the way their faces came together, as if someone had traced an old memory onto fresh canvas. When the nurse left her alone, N.N.E. reached into her handbag and pulled out a small mirror. She looked at herself, tired, pale, slightly swollen, and then looked again at her sons. They didn't look like her. Not really. It hit her with such force that she pressed a hand to her chest. She hadn't said his name in months, hadn't even allowed herself to picture him. But now she couldn't unsee it. Darlington. It was all over their faces. His nose, his skin tone, even the shape of their ears. For a moment panic gripped her. Would others see it too? Would they ask questions? She told herself it didn't matter. She had chosen this. She would raise them. Alone, if necessary. And still, deep in her gut, she knew this secret wasn't one that could stay buried forever. It was 2 weeks later when Amaka came visiting again, bringing packs of baby diapers and a hot flask of pepper soup. She had just returned from Enugu, still tired from the extended family meetings, but her face lit up when she saw the babies lying side by side on a wrapper. "Chai, see fine boys," she exclaimed, crouching beside them, her voice softening. She lifted one and cradled him carefully, her fingers trailing over his cheek. "This one get your mouth," she said, grinning. Then, after a longer pause, she looked at the second baby. Her smile faded just a little, not from sadness, but from the flicker of recognition. "But wait, oh, these children resemble my cousin Small O. You remember Darlington? Abby, it's just me?" And then he let out a low laugh, casual, almost careless. "Now you day see things," she replied, waving a hand as if to dismiss it. Anka laughed too, shaking her head, but the air between them held a different kind of silence now, one that tasted of questions left hanging and truths not yet ready to be told. The afternoon light filtered through the sheer curtains in N.N.E.'s sitting room, casting soft shadows on the walls as Amaka sat cross-legged on the floor, her phone in one hand, one of the babies resting in the crook of her other arm. It had been a long day. She'd stopped by unannounced after a work meeting nearby, eager to spend time with her godsons, as she now affectionately called them. The boys were growing fast, just a few months old but already full of movement, rolling over, grabbing at fingers, gurgling with delight when anyone leaned close to their faces. N.N.E. moved about the room, folding laundry and humming absently, letting Amaka play and cuddle freely. "I can't get over how identical they are," Amaka said at one point, switching the baby in her arms for the other. "If you don't mark their feet or something, you go confuse them, oh." They both laughed. Then Amaka did what she always did, took out her phone and began snapping photos. "Their cheeks are too fine," she murmured, angling the camera. "I'll post this one today. My page needs joy." N.N.E. didn't object. She rarely did. Hours later, after Amaka had left and the boys had finally fallen asleep, N.N.E. scrolled through social media with one hand while rocking the cot with the other. Amaka's post had gone up already, a collage of smiling baby photos, a short caption about visiting her friend and being overwhelmed by cuteness. N.N.E. smiled faintly at the comments, double blessings. Ah, so adorable. God is great. But somewhere far from Lagos, in a quiet apartment in Enugu, Darlington's thumb froze as he scrolled past the same post. He hadn't been searching for anything. It just appeared and made his profile, a few baby pictures, nothing extraordinary. Except everything about those children's faces hit him like a thunderclap. He enlarged the image, staring first out of curiosity, then with a sharp breath of disbelief. Their eyes, their noses, that familiar mouth. He sat up slowly, heart pounding, and whispered to no one in particular, "No way." The more he looked, the less he could deny it. It was like staring at his childhood all over again. There was no explanation. Only a question forming steadily in his chest. Could they be mine? That evening, Annie's phone rang 3 times before she picked up. She didn't recognize the number at first, but the voice on the line pulled her into instant awareness. N.E. Darlington said, quietly, deliberately, "I saw something today." Her throat tightened. She said nothing. Amaka posted photos, he continued. Twins. And they look like me. N.E. stood by the window, her heart loud in her ears, fingers gripping the edge of the curtain. "They're not yours," she said too quickly, her voice too steady. There was silence on the other end, then a low, bitter chuckle. "Really?" he asked. "You expect me to believe that?" She didn't respond. "We need to talk," he added, his tone harder now. "Face to face. And if you're still denying it, then I want a DNA test." The line went dead before she could reply. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of months pressing down on her. Outside, the evening settled into dusk. Inside, the truth had started to rise, like smoke that could no longer be hidden under any roof. The waiting room was too cold. Enemy wrapped her arms tightly around herself, though she had worn a thick Ankara blouse that morning, thinking it would be enough. The clinic's receptionist had been polite, almost cheerful, when she handed them the form for the DNA test, but nothing about this moment felt light. Darlington sat 2 chairs away, silent, his arms folded, his gaze fixed on a spot on the tiled floor. They had barely spoken since he arrived in Lagos. When he knocked on her door the day before, she had opened it slowly, like someone expecting a storm. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded. He had only looked at her, long and hard, and said, "I still want the test." And now here they were. The boys were at her neighbor's house, blissfully unaware of the tension that had trailed their father into the city. And Annie swallowed hard and looked at Darlington again, wanting to say something, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain the months of silence, the fear of judgment, the pride that kept her quiet even as the weight grew? The nurse finally called them in. The procedure was quick, just swabs, a few signatures, instructions about when to return for the results. Darlington spoke only when necessary, answering questions in a flat, measured tone. When it was over, they stood in the hallway outside the lab, caught in an awkward pause. "You didn't have to lie," he said at last, not with anger, but with a kind of tired disbelief. His voice was low, but it pressed against her like a hand to the chest. "All this time, N.E. Why?" She exhaled shakily, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. "Because I was scared," she said. "Because I didn't know how you'd take it. I didn't know what you wanted from me. From them." Darlington's expression tightened. "I never even got the chance to decide." That struck her harder than anything else he could have said. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The damage wasn't just in the lie, it was in the choice she had taken from him. She turned away, blinking back the sting in her eyes. "I wasn't trying to be cruel," she whispered. "I thought I was protecting myself, and them." They walked out of the clinic in silence. The sky was overcast, clouds gathering thick and gray above the buildings. On the sidewalk, street vendors called out to passers-by, selling boiled groundnuts and sachets of pure water. The world, indifferent, moved on. Darlington didn't follow her home. He said he needed space to think. She understood. That night, Nne sat alone on the edge of her bed, listening to the soft breathing of her sons in the next room. She stared at her phone, the last message he had sent still open on the screen. "Let me know when the results come out." No punctuation, no warmth. Just a sentence carved out of weariness. She thought about replying, about saying something to soften the distance, but the truth sat too heavily between them now. She walked to the boys' room instead, stood over their cot, and watched them sleep, so peaceful, so unaware. In the quiet, a part of her broke open, and she whispered a promise she hadn't dared to say aloud: "I'll make it right." Somehow. The clinic smelled the same when she returned a week later, sterile, with a faint hint of disinfectant and dried paper. Nne sat alone this time, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she waited for her name to be called. The results were ready. Darlington hadn't joined her. He had insisted she collect the envelope first. "You already know the truth," he'd said on the phone days earlier, his voice cool, controlled. "You handed it to me yourself." So she had come, heart pounding steadily beneath her chest like a quiet drum. When the nurse handed her the sealed brown envelope, Nne held it against her chest for a moment before slipping it into her handbag without opening it. She didn't need to read it. There was no suspense for her, only the dread of handing it to the one person who now looked at her with a kind of distance she couldn't navigate. Outside, the sun was cruelly bright, and the sounds of honking buses and yelling conductors made her head ache as she walked to the nearby car park where Darlington had asked to meet. He stood by the bonnet of his car, arms crossed, his face unreadable. When she reached him, she didn't speak. She simply handed him the envelope. He opened it slowly, tearing the seal with the same kind of care he might reserve for something fragile. His eyes moved quickly across the page. Then he looked up, not with surprise, not even anger, but with something heavier: disappointment. "So you knew," he said. Not a question, a statement. Nne's lips parted, but her voice failed. She nodded instead, her eyes falling to the ground. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, as if the word could mend the months he had spent unknowingly missing the early coups, the first smiles, the tiny fists that had reached out to the world without him. "Sorry?" he echoed, letting out a dry, humorless laugh. "You carried my children, birthed them, and let me find out through Facebook. And you think sorry is enough?" She flinched, the words cutting cleanly through her resolve. "I didn't want to be a burden," she murmured. "I didn't want to trap you into something you didn't ask for." For a moment, Darlington said nothing. He looked away, jaw clenched, then turned back with a voice gentler than she expected. "You never even gave me the chance to try," he said. "That's what hurts most." His words hung in the humid air between them, and Nne felt the weight of them settle on her shoulders. The noise of the city swirled around them, but she stood still, absorbing the quiet ache in his voice. "I was wrong," she admitted. "I thought I could carry it all on my own, but I see now I was just scared of being vulnerable." Darlington stared at her for a long time. Then, without another word, he opened his car door and slid inside. He didn't drive off immediately. He just sat there, hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead. Nne watched him, unsure whether to walk away or knock on the window. Eventually she turned and began walking back toward the road, the envelope still heavy in her bag, but her chest lighter than it had been in months. Something had cracked open between them, not quite healing, but no longer hidden. The days that followed felt strangely suspended, like time had slowed to watch them from a distance. Nne moved through her routines quietly, feeding the boys, bathing them, folding their tiny clothes with methodical care, but her thoughts were rarely in the room. At night, when they were finally asleep and the hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound left, she would sit by the window, her phone in hand, rereading old messages Darlington had sent long ago. They weren't romantic, just short exchanges from that first visit, directions, polite questions, harmless banter. But now they felt like echoes from another life. He hadn't called since the day he read the test result, and she hadn't called either. She told herself it was to give him space, but the truth was simpler. She didn't know what she would say if he answered. Instead, she wrote, at first in her head. Then, one quiet Sunday afternoon, she took out a pen and began to write with trembling hands. It wasn't a long letter, but every line was carefully chosen. She wrote of fear, how it can root itself deep in a person and grow wild, making you believe silence is safer than honesty. She wrote of shame, not the loud, obvious kind, but the quiet guilt that follows you into every room. She told him about her dreams, the way she used to imagine raising the boys with someone who loved them before convincing herself she didn't deserve that. Most of all, she wrote about the twins, not just their faces, but who they were becoming, one with a laugh that came in bursts, the other quieter, always watching. She described how they reached for each other in sleep, how they both cried when one was taken from the room. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully, placed it in a plain white envelope, and sent it through a trusted friend who traveled often between Lagos and Enugu. There was no guarantee he'd respond, but at least he would know. At least he would have the truth. A week passed before she heard anything. It was a Sunday evening, and she had just put the boys down when there was a soft knock at the door. Her heart leapt once, then again, before she even reached for the handle. Darlington stood there, dressed simply, a small overnight bag in hand, his eyes tired but clear. He didn't say much at first, just stepped inside slowly as she moved out of the way. For a long moment, they stood in the living room, not speaking, just breathing the same air. Then he looked at her, voice low. I got your letter. She nodded. He moved closer, reaching into the bag and pulling out 2 small blue teddy bears. I didn't come empty-handed, he said with a half smile. And with that, the tension eased, not completely, but enough. She showed him to the boys' room, where they lay sleeping side by side. He stared at them for a long time, lips slightly parted, hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. When he finally whispered, They're beautiful, Nne turned away, tears gathering in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the fragile hope she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. The morning light crept gently across the floor, casting long streaks of warmth through the half-drawn curtains. The house was still, save for the faint gurgling sounds of the twins waking in their crib. None stirred from the mattress she had laid beside them, blinking slowly as the soft weight of morning settled over her. The events of the past weeks hovered at the edges of her thoughts, unspoken words, cautious forgiveness, and the steady re-entry of Darlington into their lives. Since that night he arrived with the teddy bears, he had stayed for 3 more weekends, each visit quiet but deliberate. He didn't ask to sleep over. Instead, he booked a small hotel nearby, showing up early each morning and leaving after the twins had been bathed and fed their night bottles. He was learning how to hold them, how to calm their cries, how to rock them to sleep without needing instruction. Nne watched from across the room sometimes, her heart caught between wonder and uncertainty, trying to reconcile this version of Darlington with the memory of a single night long ago. One Saturday afternoon, as the sun pressed down gently and the boys napped side by side, Nne stepped outside to find Darlington sitting on the small wooden bench under the mango tree beside her flat. He looked up when she approached, the corners of his lips lifting into something soft, something close to peace. They love the sound of your voice, she said, taking a seat beside him. Whenever you read to them, they stop wriggling. He chuckled faintly. It's probably the accent, he replied. They're still trying to figure out if I'm serious or just pretending to be. There was a silence between them then, not tense, but reflective. The kind that comes when 2 people are trying to build something carefully, without rushing. I don't want to come and go anymore, he said after a while, his fingers clasped between his knees. I want to stay, if you'll let me. Not just for them, but for you too. Her eyes searched his, not for doubt, but for sincerity, and she found it. No grand promises. Just a man who had shown up again and again, even when it was difficult. She didn't cry. She didn't rush into his arms. She simply nodded slowly and leaned against his shoulder. The weight of that small gesture held years of unspoken yearning, of forgiven mistakes, of quiet trust rebuilt from the ground up. In the weeks that followed, preparations were simple. No lavish celebration, no crowd. Just a few close friends, Amaka among them, teasing and emotional as she tied Ini's gelly on the small registry morning. The boys wore matching white native attires, wriggling in Darlington's arms during the brief ceremony. There were no speeches, only the soft murmur of vows spoken in low tones, and a photographer who snapped more candid smiles than posed ones. Later, as evening fell and the house settled into quiet again, Ini sat with her head on Darlington's lap, the twins asleep nearby, the scent of jollof rice still lingering in the air. She didn't feel like she had been rescued. She felt like she had chosen herself, her sons, and a man who came back not with words, but with presence. And for the first time in a long while, her heart was full without needing to explain why. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.